A former chief deputy in Sunflower County is sentenced for his role in helping dealers take drugs through the Mississippi Delta. Marvin Flowers will spend more than 7 years in prison for aiding and abetting. He was number 2 in command at Sunflower County Sheriff's Office. He took several bribes to look the other way when the drugs were transported. 20 people were arrested in that Delta drug conspiracy case. 14 were law enforcement officers. At least 5 other officers either pleaded guilty or are in the process of doing so.